Hello and welcome to the Advent window for the 9th of December in the TooFatLardies Advent calendar for 2024. And behind this window is the question: how do you influence the pace or tempo of a war game? Is this something the rules should create, or something for the game organiser? So that's a question which to me really asks about how to make a good war game into a great war game if we possibly can. I think one of the first places to think about when anyone's mentioning pace or tempo is to think of the circumstances in art or media that we really see pace and tempo and when we really enjoy it. And a good example probably is a movie or a TV programme or even a book, and having a plot which increases the drama up to a climactic, a cinematic ending. So think of any of your favourite war movies, whether it's Zulu or Waterloo or Saving Private Ryan. The pacing in those films deliberately leads to the final end scene, the real dramatic moment. It's really a nice thought to try and create that narrative feeling in our war games. But I do think we need to be a little bit cautious in that regard. Film and media pacing works primarily because it controls the presentation of predetermined actions. The narrative ending is known in advance. By contrast, a miniature war game doesn't have that. It's a game with a variety of outcomes which are dictated by the different players around the table, by the scenario, by history, and also to some extent by luck. Miniature war games don't have that predetermined action sequence or ending. At least not normally, or perhaps at least not without a little bit of help. But if that's the sort of tempo which is a theme that we want to try and add into our games, how best to do that? I've tried a couple of ways in the past. One approach is to create mechanisms to try and capture elements of that tempo, but without dictating the outcome of the game. So mechanisms can affect the pacing of the action on the tabletop. An example on this might be to have some form of advantage which is created in the game. So it might be an added dice roll from the start of the action, which is given to troops which are elite in some way. Or it might be an in-game event, the sort of thing which kind of is taken from the ideas in video games. Have you yet collected the sacred sword blessed by the gods? If you have, you're going to get an extra dice roll whenever that's used in action. Or perhaps it may be objective based. As soon as you get to the first jump off line, your off-table commander provides you with a reinforcement as a result. Now, none of those should be game-changing. Those mechanisms are all working through the rules and are governed and restricted by the rules. In some of those situations, there's a clear immediate connection between on-table success and reward, with an additional advantage coming from that. So tempo can therefore be created by offering more of these advantage points towards the time of the game when you want the tempo to speed up. Almost like preset narrative points in the storyline of the battle. Taken together, those mechanisms should encourage forward momentum, prevent pauses and downtime, and generally increase the speed and tempo of the game. But there is a caution point there as well, because that sort of momentum can also lead to a bit of a death spiral. One side is gaining those advantage points and the other just isn't able to collect them. And that's going to be great for the person who's winning, but not so much fun if you're on the losing side. Although, the other side of that coin is that, that is a narrative result in its own regard. I generally feel that those in-game benefits, if they're sprinkled too often into the game, they can distort the action and they can shift the balance between the different players. So they need extensive play testing. And also, it's really important to sort of think about how the action on the tabletop will develop. We've probably talked before on the Oddcast or the Advent calendars about trying to think of how the game will play out in advance, which are the different areas of manoeuvre, which are the different friction points, where's the combat going to take place, and trying to add those in-game advantages to those areas of the table is one way in which you can try and balance up how the game may play out and how one side might be advantaged as against the other, and to make sure there's some balance. There's also another discussion there as well, because when we talk about the death spiral in a game, one side losing, the other side winning, that also stimulates a discussion about, well, what is losing in a war game? And again, as we've chatted about over the years, there's different ways of winning and losing. Tactical defeat, obviously, but also losing and winning according to the scenario objectives or the game objectives. That can be a different thing. And then there's also a question of, well, what are the historical measures of success or failure? What are the societal results that one side is looking for? They may be different. They may be asymmetrical in their own right. So turning from thinking about the mechanisms for the game which produces a clear result and advantage for one side as against the other potentially, thinking about tempo in a very literal sense, in using a clock. That's something which I've employed in a number of games. I think Richard probably gave me the first idea of this in our Boer War games, and I've taken it forward certainly in the games that we've played of Flashing Blades, which was our game of 17th century sword play in accordance with the books of Alexandre Dumas. One of the games that I put on a number of years ago really was focused around a clock. The perilous journey of the Comtesse de Chablis, in which the Comtesse had been falsely accused by Cardinal Richelieu and was about to be executed in a market square in Paris, and the musketeers had an hour to save her. It was really interesting in that game seeing how, as the clock ticked down, there was a very natural tempo which was created for both sides. And we ramped up the action to a certain degree because at different points of the clock, new characters were introduced and new cards were available for each of the sides to use. So again, another way of not just using the clock as a device for time, but as a device to navigate the narrative. So each of those different mechanisms that we've talked about are really something which are within the rules. But there's another way of trying to create tempo. We've tried that. I've certainly tried that. I find this more difficult. And this is really through the umpire or the games organiser, the games runner, if you like, working to try and create that tempo by various different tricks and manipulations. And there are some dramatic aspects to that. For instance, the way in which the narrative is presented by the game organiser can be speeded up at certain times just by the way that the voice can work. The voice can be more dramatic at certain points than others. That really does work quite well, but it's not necessarily something which is going to be easy to relate to somebody who's just reading a set of rules. It very much depends on the different person who's running a game, whether that's part of their toolkit that they want to employ or not. As opposed to those sort of dramatic devices, another possibility is that the umpire or the game organiser is the person who's really responsible for using those mechanisms in the way that they think best. A simple example would be to make sure that the game gives the very best game possible before the players as regards continuing up to the right time, getting the right feel, and that can involve, giving one side an advantage at one point and giving the other side a balancing advantage at another. Yeah, perhaps almost like a referee, as opposed to somebody who's simply staged the game as a game in its own regard. The difficulty with that, I think, is that the problem of preparing something which is almost like that balance is that the game organiser is in a position to almost predetermine which of the sides is winning at a particular point, or what the different balance should be at any different point in time. So the game organiser in those circumstances is potentially operating as a third party to the game. It's a question as to whether the players discover that, which can be awkward, and also it's a question of, whether you actually tell the players in advance that that's going to happen. It's all very well navigating or canalising the action, but it is a little bit more awkward when you feel that in a game which is bilateral between two sets of players, that you've got a third party, being the game organiser, that might, in the worst case scenario, be seen to be playing God. Whether that's a problem depends on the players and the game organiser, but I think a large part also depends about what the players knew in advance. So, in a classic game of Dungeons and Dragons, everyone always knows that the game master is going to be introducing different monsters at different times in the game. That's much less normal, I think, in a historical war game. So generally, I think creating tempo in a game and navigating that tempo is something which probably has an element of both game mechanisms and also the game organiser. But I think that the key thing for me in looking at all of those factors introduced in the games that we've played over the years is to try and remember that a little goes a very, very long way. Game tempo is best when it seems to occur naturally. If it's too forced, then that just feels odd. Trying to arrange and adjust the game tempo by these different routes is something which perhaps needs a delicate touch. And the good news in that regard is that everyone's skill in that regard is always going to be increased by playing more games.